because of snow and ice cancellations and me being stranded in um, an airport for a couple of days. I wasn't able to be able to meet the class in person. So I'm going to give you some of the New Testament introduction that we normally do, but with the caveat that I only had 4 hours of sleep because I spent the night in the airport. So I'm going to just start here and may have to continue later. But New Testament background is really important. Getting to know someone, it helps to know their background. So my wife and I, we come from very different backgrounds. She was raised in a strong Christian home in Republic of Congo. I was raised in a non-religious family. I was converted from atheism. We were each about the same age when we were converted, although I'm older than she is, as you can tell by looking at me. My lovely wife is just, she's lovely. But anyway, we came from very different backgrounds, and denominationally, she was kind of mainstream evangelical. I was Pentecostal, uh, evangelical, but Pentecostal. And anyway, uh, we fell in love. We met at Duke University, and we were both shy. So we stayed friends, but we didn't tell each other until a few years later that we loved each other. She then was caught up in a war where she was a refugee for 18 months. And anyway, after the war, we got married and have lived happily. Wouldn't say forever after. We will with the Lord, but for now, we've lived happily for our lives. So um, that's just some background about us, but knowing some background about each other helped us, not least me knowing some French and her knowing lots of English helped us communicate. But it wasn't just language, it was also culture, because even gestures can mean something very different from one culture to another. And it took us a while to get to know each other, get to know each other in light of our backgrounds, our culture, our customs, our families, and so on. Well, similarly, getting to know the history behind the New Testament helps you get to understand the New Testament better. Now, that doesn't mean you have to know everything, and obviously we won't cover everything in one lecture, but this is just an introduction to things that are really helpful for you to know to put things in place when you do read the New Testament. So there were various Jewish groups in Judea and Galilee in Jesus's day. Josephus, never one to underestimate numbers, estimates that there were about 6,000 Pharisees. He doesn't give us the number of the Sadducees, but it's clear that they were a smaller group, more elite. And the Essenes were somewhat smaller. He estimates at about 4,000, although we don't run into them in the New Testament. They seem to have mostly hung out in the desert and places like that. Some in Jerusalem, but basically Pharisees were more popular with the people, and Sadducees were more elite, and they were the ones who were uh, actually, compared to the general population, maybe more elite than definitely more elite than most people. So by the year 70, Jesus' own followers, sometimes called the Way, Nazarenes, disciples, they may have outnumbered all these groups put together, especially if you take Acts 21:20 literally, which not everybody does, but it speaks of myriadoi of Jewish followers of Jesus in Judea and Galilee, now, or especially Judea in that passage. And that is, myriadoi means tens of thousands, again, if you take it literally, which means the movement grew really rapidly toward the beginning. Some people have said, well, it just grew a little bit. It just grew gradually to where it was a few centuries later. But most movements don't just grow gradually and evenly. They often grow in spurts. And it looks like they had a pretty big spurt at the beginning. But that's all. Some of the earlier claims that couldn't be true were based on estimates of Jerusalem's population at 25,000. Joachim Jeremias did a great job with what he had to work with, but archaeological evidence since then, estimates are often closer to 80,000 in first century Jerusalem. Whatever the case, way more than 25,000. But all these groups put together were only a small minority of the Jewish people. And that's true in Judea. How much more is it true in the empire, the Roman Empire, where it's estimated that there were millions of people? The majority of Jewish people, it's usually said, lived outside of Judea. Many of them lived to the east in Parthia, but even in the Roman Empire, some have estimated like 4/5 of Jewish people lived outside of Judea and Galilee. I'm not sure about that, but certainly there were massive numbers, especially in Syria, number of cities in Asia Minor, and way big in Alexandria and parts of Egypt, especially Alexandria, even though Alexandrians claimed that they were not part of Egypt. Well, Alexandrian citizens who were Greek descendants claimed that they were not part of Egypt. But one problem with me speaking when I haven't had enough sleep is I tend to digress too much. So, Pharisees. The two schools of Pharisees in Jesus' day were divided between the Shammaites and the Hillelites. The Shemaites, the followers of Shammai, predominated. The followers of Hillel predominated later. So when we talk about Judaism today, thinking about what developed from rabbinic Judaism a bit later than this period, it traces its traditions, especially, well, its earliest traditions, is more through the school of Hillel than Shammai. So don't read what you think about Pharisees in the New Testament onto modern rabbinic Judaism. I mean, obviously there's overlap. There's overlap with Jesus too. But the Pharisees were not generally part of the political elite in Jesus' day. Under Salome Alexandra, a couple centuries earlier, they had been, but there was a backlash. Anyway, they were more popular with the people than the Sadducees were. So the incumbents were not the most popular, but nobody had a say in that. So at this point, so probably though the Pharisees were economically better off and certainly better educated than most Judeans and Galileans, but most of the priestly aristocracy apparently were Sadducees. Not saying no exceptions, but most of them. And they seem to have predominated in the Sanhedrin too. Jesus's political adversaries, the ones who engineered his execution. I mean, you do have in Mark where it says that some Pharisees and Herodians plotted to kill him, but they plotted, they never got it done. But, you know, it only took the Sadducees, high priests, and them in Jerusalem about a week after Jesus publicly challenged them, overturned tables in the temple, and so on. So his political adversaries, who were most effective once he got to Jerusalem, which was the most populous place by far in Judea, and was also the center of political and religious power, although the religious power was more widely disseminated. The chief priests, who were mostly Sadducees, they were an elite minority, and they belonged, well, the most powerful ones belonged to a new Sanhedrin installed by Herod the Great. I may explain a bit more about that later on, but these individuals were probably not installed by him, but their families were. Rome ruled through municipal aristocracies loyal to Rome, and this particular municipal aristocracy, like quite a lot of them in Mediterranean antiquity, were known to abuse power. They were reportedly corrupt, and we may talk more about that in the course of the course. Just to say that pretty much all reports we have of them, none of them from themselves, but all the reports we have of them were that they were corrupt. So Josephus tells us that about some of the chief priests, especially the highest high priests, and in this century, and um, early rabbinic traditions, like in Tosefta, Minkot, is it 1321, something like that, talk about this. And so, I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had it in for the chief priesthood for a long time at this point. So, and then of course you have what you have in the New Testament. So some people say, the New Testament is anti-Jewish. Look, it wasn't anti-Jewish to be against the particular leaders in Jerusalem at that time any more than it was anti-Jewish for a lot of people to be against Herod the Great, although they weren't against him particularly long because he usually killed them. But anyway, um, they were reputed to abuse power against Pharisees, Essenes, and Jesus followers. And it is true that we don't have their own perspective on this, and I'm sure their own perspective was much more positive. But when nobody else likes you, chances are there's something about you, but it could just be incumbency, whatever. Pharisees actually probably defended James, Jesus's younger brother, when James was executed by a chief priest, when Roman governor had been sent back home and another Roman governor had taken his place. So the Pharisees, Josephus says, people meticulous in the law, but wherever else he says that, or pretty much wherever else he says that, he's talking about the Pharisees. They stuck up for James and other people who were executed and said, that's not right. These were extrajudicial executions. And so it looks like around the 60s or so of the first century, some of the Pharisees respected some of Jesus's followers. So yes, there were conflicts between Jesus and some of the Pharisees, but there were conflicts between the Hillelite Pharisees and the Shemite Pharisees. So sometimes, as you read the New Testament, you'll see that Jesus sometimes sided with Shemites on some things, like on divorce, sided with Hillelites on cleaning the inside of the cup before the outside, although he's speaking figuratively, but still, there were a number of issues where he sounds a lot closer to the Hillelites who later prevailed. But all that just to give a backdrop, so you don't read the New Testament in an anti-Jewish way, as has often been done in history because of lack of context. There is polemic in the Gospels, just like you have in Amos and Hosea, denouncing the sins of Israel. But compare the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, the Dead Sea Scrolls can hardly be called anti-Jewish, but they were anti the high priest of their day and may have been anti-Pharisees, based on wordplay in Hebrews. A number have suggested that the speakers of smooth things in the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to the Pharisees. But the big thing is the Dead Sea Scrolls community considered themselves very, very likely Essenes. It's debated, but I'm pretty well convinced with the early interpretation that is, I think, still the dominant one, that they represent especially the voices of the Essenes. They consider themselves the true faithful heirs of biblical promises, that they were the righteous remnant of Israel. And they spoke of the rest of Israel as the community of Belial, or the assembly of Satan, which is really strong language. But when you look at that, keep in mind, this is intra-Jewish criticism, which was in fact pretty common. And sociologically speaking, it's often groups that have a lot in common that clash because they don't have access to others. So some people on my right say, you're too far to the left. And some people on my left say, you're too far to the right. So those who are nearest sometimes get the take the hits. But anyway, um, and later on you had rabbis criticizing the Pharisees, but you also have later rabbis complaining about most kinds of Pharisees. I mean, you have it's beautiful homiletically, so you don't take everything literally, but they speak of seven kinds of Pharisees, and uh, one was the bleeding Pharisee, a bruised Pharisee, walks around with his eyes closed, lest he lust after a woman, and bam, he bangs it into a wall. That's what he gets for walking around with his eyes closed, right? So they had these different kinds of Pharisees that they considered hypocritical or whatever, and only the best kind of Pharisee, the one who served God out of the fear of God or out of the love of God, that was the only good kind of Pharisee. So, Jesus has conflicts with Pharisees. Pharisees had conflict with Pharisees. I don't know that things have changed that much. We have Americans who fight Americans. We have different political parties in the US that sometimes don't get along too well, and so on. So we have parts of the church that don't get along too well with each other. Anyway, intra-Jewish polemic was very common. If Jesus is Israel's rightful king, though, then on that premise, the prophets, like they would say, follow the law of Moses, they would say, follow Jesus. And they would, with those demands, also criticize those who didn't. And in the New Testament also, we see Gentile Christians truly submitted to Israel's king being viewed as proselytes, spiritual proselytes, not that they supplant the Jewish people, but that they are, they share, like proselytes would, in the promises to the patriarchs. They become heirs of the covenant because they follow the covenant through following the Messiah that God has sent. Anyway, that's a whole other story that we could talk a lot about. I'm starting to work on a commentary on Romans, and just too much to talk about. So picking up just before the Old Testament leaves off, I'm presupposing that you have already memorized the Old Testament before you start New Testament, but knowing that that presupposition is certainly wrong, then I have to discard that and just summarize something. So picking up just before the Old Testament leaves off, 586, 587 BC, or BCE, if you prefer, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem's temple and carried the Judahites into exile. That's why you have various psalms lamenting that. Psalm 74, Psalm 137 gets a little violent. Bummer. This is, terrible. Well, it was a terrible situation. Becomes a sad pattern. God had warned Israel that if they sinned, I'll lay your cities waste, will make your sanctuaries desolate, Leviticus 26. And of course, Jeremiah and others before him had warned this was coming. Now, this was not the last time that Judah's temple would be desecrated or destroyed due to sin. And we have the New Testament talking about that happening also. I believe some of it before 70 and some of it afterwards looking back. So, but when Cyrus became king, well, the Persians said, hey, look, we're your benefactors. We didn't take you into captivity. Somebody else did. We're going to send you all back home if you want. And so many Judahites returned to their land and they rebuilt their temple. But there were other hard things coming. And you can look at the cartoons on your own time if you want to. So Alexander of Macedon came. He wasn't like one of the hard times so much for Judea, but he was for Persia. Alexander of Macedon decided to get the Persians back for what they'd done to the Greeks, considering himself culturally Greek. Like virtually all empires, the Persians eventually grew indulgent and weak. They were wealthy. They didn't have a lot of enemies. They kept a lot of people happy. But Alexander conquered Persia. But when he died at the age of 33, and according to the stories we have, he actually got along pretty well with Judea. But After he died at the age of 33, his successors carved up his empire, and the two most important parts, especially for knowing about Judea, were the Seleucids, who settled in Syria, and the Ptolemies, who settled in Egypt, followers of a couple of his generals. There were really four of them, but four areas that things were carved up into. But the Seleucids and the Ptolemies appear in probably Daniel 11. The Seleucids, the Syria in the north, as the king of the north, and the Ptolemies as the kings of the south. Most ancient rulers expected worship, while the new Syrian king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, wanted everybody to be united, but what he meant by united was everybody had to be the same, basically like do things the Greek way, worship our Greek gods, including himself. Now, Greeks did not worship their rulers, but some were able to finesse that in this period because of influence from other cultures, places that they'd conquered. But there was this pattern in antiquity. When you conquered a place, sometimes you also got influenced by it. Certainly Greek culture spread in the Roman Empire and was very prestigious often to Romans, but that's all another story. So he introduced many elements of Greek culture. Really cultured people exercised nude, not during the snowstorm, but back then, many cultured people exercised nude. They were to speak Greek. They worshiped Greek gods. They wanted to have horse races, chariot races, foot races. I'm not against all those things, but these were like the cultural elite, and it was challenging to Judean tradition, and also challenging, especially with the worship of the gods, challenging to Israel's historic faith. Now, even though they were promoting the reaction, the backlash was promoting Judean values, Judean culture, it's interesting that the books that do so, that remain to us, are especially in Greek, because some things were just part of the milieu. So after Alexander's conquests, most of the urban areas in the Eastern Mediterranean world, Greek became the lingua franca, the popular language. Today it might be the lingua angla, I don't know. English is very popular. Generation from now, maybe if the word tarries, it might be Chinese or something else. Spanish and Portuguese are pretty popular in my country too, and certainly in my hemisphere. But anyway, the local populace often spoke Aramaic, the Syriac language in the in at least much of the Eastern Mediterranean, certainly in Syria and Judea. So you have like already parts of the book of Ezra, parts of the book of Daniel are in Aramaic because that was widely spoken. And in, I believe it's in Nehemiah, maybe it's Nehemiah 8. And I should look this up if I forgot. But anyway, they would read it in Hebrew, read the scriptures in Hebrew, and then give the sense in a way that people understood. So a lot of people, Aramaic was their first language, their mother tongue. But in a lot of the urban areas and in places where there was more trade and so on, a lot of people were familiar with Greek, and we have a lot of inscriptional evidence and so on. So that was a big digression, but it's important to get as much of the context as possible. So just to show, however, that the king was serious about enforced Hellenization, Greek culture in Judea, it wasn't just benevolent aspects of Greek culture. He's said to have slaughtered a pig on the altar in the new temple in Jerusalem. In any case, he he wanted things the Greek way, with Greek deities. So this constituted another abomination of desolation in the year 165 BC. The Judeans were not happy. There's another desecration that takes place under Pompey, the Roman general, who goes into the temple area where he's not supposed to go and does some other things. But the priests who led the revolt were called Hasmoneans, also nicknamed Maccabees, that is, the hammers. If I can find in there. Anyway, I better not do it to my computer. Especially not with this bigger one, if I can get this out, but just as a visual aid, so you remember that they're called the hammers. And I don't know that the hammers looked exactly like, well, they didn't look exactly like that back then. But anyway, they overthrew Syrian rule in Judea and established an independent Jewish kingdom. And they became a dynasty of priest kings, which incidentally is forbidden in the Torah. It does have separation of powers, like priests and kings. But they became priest kings, and they were not from the line of Zadok. Last we knew in the Hebrew scriptures, the Zadokites were supposed to be the chief priests. So here we had some that were, other people didn't think they were supposed to be there. So Dead Sea Scrolls talk about Zadokites in a good way, the right kind of priests. But then Rome began to expand, and division weakened Judea. One Judean faction basically was two brothers. Each of them wanted to be the king, and each of them sought Rome's help against the other faction. Well, eventually, Rome helped one faction win, and through them, Rome gained power. Rome helped establish Herod the Great in power. Herod made sure that Jerusalem's local aristocracy, its Sanhedrin, supported him. As I mentioned earlier, he killed the existing nobles and put his own supporters in power. Now, how's that for political acumen? This is a very bad model for church leadership, by the way. I'm not recommending this. And it may work politically, but obviously I'm not recommending this as an exercise in Christian ethics. But his political instincts were normally quite good, except once in a while. Unfortunately, he was friends with Antony, but enemies of Cleopatra. Now, how is that going to work? If you're friends with somebody, but the person that they particularly in love with, your enemies, that's not going to go over too well, probably, because, if you are like for me, but against my wife, I'm going to choose my wife over you. No offense. But anyway, eventually it didn't matter, because when Caesar conquered them both, this is Octavian, the one who became known as the Augustus Caesar, or in Greek, Sebastus, the glorious one, the August one. When Caesar actually didn't, they got killed before Caesar got to them. But when his agents, military, army, so on, conquered them both, Herod said, you know what? I was a loyal friend to Mark Antony, even to his death, even though, you are so superb. Obviously he was going to lose, you're so much a better politician, military leader, which he wasn't, and so many other things than Antony was. But you can see what a loyal friend I am. I stuck with him even to the end, despite his deficiencies. Seeing what a loyal friend I can be, wouldn't you like me to be your friend? Caesar said, you got it. And Herod was confirmed in power. Herod was a famous builder. He dedicated temples for other gods, especially Caesar, in places like Sebast, which was, Samaria, but it got renamed Sebast, meaning Augustus's town. And he built a temple for Augustus there. He built a temple, Caesarea Maritima, it was really Strato's Tower, but he renames it Caesarea in honor of Caesar, and so on. So, but in Jerusalem, he began especially the greatest temple of the ancient world for the true God. Now, I should note at this point that Herod didn't get all his money from taxes. He got a lot of money from taxes, but he also owned a lot of estates. Now, granted, he probably confiscated a lot of them, killed a few people, and so on. But Herod, yeah, he was independently wealthy, and so he was able to build a lot of things, built things even in distant cities away from Judea and Galilee, trying to extend his fame and so on. Well, he started building the greatest temple of the ancient world for the true God. Now, you may have heard about the seven wonders of the ancient world, that the temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the wonders of the seven world. That's mentioned, well, not that she was, it was one of the seven wonders, but her temple is mentioned in Acts chapter 19. But the seven wonders were picked before he built the Jerusalem temple. I mean, the temple of Artemis, it was bigger than the Parthenon in Athens, the temple of Athena, but it was way smaller than the Jerusalem temple. I mean, Jewish people all through the ancient world, they had one God, and so all the resources went to one temple. They weren't divided divided among a bunch of different gods. And already in the Old Testament, you had a tax you were supposed to pay for the upkeep of the temple. In Exodus, at least the way it was being interpreted, so all adult Jewish males were supposed to pay a half shekel tax. And this temple eventually got so rich that they were just making a vine out of gold, and they kept adding, making it longer. But anyway, in his day, he made this massive temple. And here are just some other pictures to get it in your mind based on the model in Jerusalem. Some of his decorations, however, didn't go over too well with his own people, at least for fairly conservative Pharisees. So there were a couple rabbis, a couple Pharisaic teachers who complained about it, that he had a golden eagle in his temple as a symbol of Rome. You don't do that in a temple of the one true God, especially when Caesar was being worshipped in some places as a god, carrying on that tradition of certain peoples in the East. So some of his decorations were considered a bit too pagan. These two Pharisaic teachers complained about it, and about 50 of their disciples went out and acted on their behalf. I think it got the teachers in a bit of trouble. So please be careful what you say, I said. Anyway, these disciples went and tried to take down his golden eagle decoration. Herod had them killed. This is not a good model for conflict resolution, but it keeps coming up as a theme with Herod. I don't know why. Herod was even political about some of his many marriages. He married Mariamne, a Maccabean princess. So she's from the previous dynasty that was loved by most of the people. And she would help validate him with the people. It's like, which of the Henrys was it in England who, he could unite two of the dynasties of the warring families, and then their descendants would be, would unite everybody. So Herod married Mariamne, this Maccabean princess, who would validate him with the people. She was so popular that's when, I mean, even though Miriam, the name is already there for Moses' sister, this name just exploded in popularity. Everybody wanted to name their daughter Miriam, or translated, we say Mary, Miriam or Miriamne. They wanted to name their daughters that. It was the most popular, by Jesus' day, the most popular woman's name. I think Miriam / Mary, Mariamne, and Salome made up like what? I don't know. Just those two names made up like 20%, 30% or more of the names of women, Jewish women, well, Judean and Galilean women in this period. Herod was an Idumean by descent, uh, that is, an Edomite, and even though they had been force converted to Judaism earlier, his ancestry didn't go over too well, and you had to be an Israelite. He was descended, you know, but they had been Jewish-ish for a while. But anyway, Mariamne was Herod's favorite wife. Unfortunately, someone falsely accused her of adultery, and disregarding politics for once, he had her strangled to death. Later, he discovered her innocence, and he felt badly about it, so he named a tower in his palace after her. 3 towers, Hippicus, Phasael, and Mariamne, named after his beloved but deceased brother, friend, and wife. One of his wives, but his favorite. So nice. Herod also disliked competition, but Mariamne's kid brother, the high priest, was getting too popular. This wasn't politically useful for Herod, so the young man had a drowning accident in a pool that archaeology shows was only about 3 feet deep. Maybe the Hasmoneans were extremely short. I don't know. And yes, Herod was insanely jealous. Nobody could be king of Judea except him. He heard 2 of his sons were plotting to take his throne, so he killed them. Later discovered they were framed by another son, Antipater, who's about to turn up. But talk about a dysfunctional family. Now, you can come from a dysfunctional family and turn out well. Joseph in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, his brothers sell him into slavery. That is a dysfunctional family. But he turned out great. And, Genesis ends up with them reconciled. They feel guilty and so on. But Herod's family was dysfunctional, and most of them did not turn out real well. So later a son, this is Antipater, really was plotting. Herod was on his deathbed, but Herod had him killed too, even though like 6 days later or whatever, he was going to kick the bucket himself. But Antipater being dead was out of his will. So, out of his will, like testament kind of will, as well as obviously other will. The Emperor Augustus allegedly said, and this is recorded later in Macrobius, it's probably an apocryphal statement, but it illustrates the point. The Emperor Augustus allegedly said, better to be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons. It was widely known in Rome that Jewish people did not eat pork. Herod cared deeply about his reputation. Okay, I didn't have a good picture. Wow, I need to update this file. I actually have pictures of Herod's tomb and all that stuff. But anyway, I didn't have a good picture of a funeral, so I just put some stuff together free. So Herod cared deeply about his reputation, and he wanted to make sure that people would mourn when he died. So he left instructions with his sister-in-law, I think. Anyway, somebody close to him. He ordered, he had some nobles arrested, ordered them to be executed when he finished dying, so that there would be mourning in the land. You know what Proverbs says about rejoicing in the land when the tyrant dies. When he died, they were released and there was rejoicing. But, at least you can say this about Herod. He cared deeply about his reputation. Okay, you can tell I'm not a big fan of Herod. Is it surprising that Herod would have killed the male babies of Bethlehem? So, speaking of which, let's step back from the history and look at the text, the literature that reflects the period, or this would be at the very distant end of living memory at this point. But anyway, what's the point in Matthew's story? Matthew has a heavy emphasis on reaching the Gentiles for God that runs through his whole gospel. So we look at the main characters. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So calendars are a little bit off. They were supposed to be calculated regarding Jesus's birth, but they didn't have all the historical records quite exactly when they made up, dating things from and before Jesus's birth. So Jesus was probably born around 6 or 7 BC. But if you were expecting Jesus to come back in the year 2000, if you were around back then, you were using the wrong calendar. The people who said he would come back in 1993 or 1994 were closer if it had been 2,000 years, but it wasn't. So Rome installed one of Herod's other sons, Archelaus, as governor in his place. Joseph and Mary avoided him, Matthew tells us, and Josephus, first century Jewish historian, shows us why that's the case. Archelaus was known for having all of his father's vices, but none of his virtues. In other words, he was not only a jerk, but he was a bad politician. Meanwhile, however, in Galilee, one of the other sons of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, he became tetrarch or governor of Galilee. He minded his own business, kept Rome happy, and stayed in power for a whole generation till the time of Jesus and John the Baptist. So you read about different Herods in the New Testament. You have a whole Herodian family. That's when he had an affair with his brother's wife, Herodias, who incidentally was also his niece and his brother's niece. Some other interesting things happened in the Herodian family. But I talk more about that when we talk about the Gospel of Mark. So just to say a little bit about it, and I don't want to take time to show this entire video, but this is a video clip from The Chosen. And anyway, maybe it didn't show. Sorry, I'm not master of technology, but the death dance of traditionally we call her Salome, because that's the only daughter of Herodias we know of from Josephus, first century Jewish historian, but we don't know that that was her only daughter. And we don't know exactly when Herodias and Herod married. But there may have been, Herod may have had political interest in Herodias as well as passion. She was a generation younger than he was, but also she was the granddaughter of Herod the Great and Mariamne, the Maccabean princess. And that would be a step up for him politically. And it would certainly be a step up for her to be married to him instead of the guy she was married to, who seems to either not have any political ambition or at least no political future. So, I mean, doesn't mean she was attracted to the guy, but from what we read in Josephus, she seems to have been fairly ambitious. And you can see why she wouldn't have liked John the Baptist saying that their marriage was illegitimate, because what happens if Herod Antipas divorces her? her former husband's not going to take her back. So, I mean, she's got a lot at stake. That doesn't justify her behavior. But anyway, just trying to help you see some of the different perspectives, even though I'm not a fan of Herod the Great or of Herod Antipas or of Herodias, but just a little bit of sympathy. So Antipas was only a tetrarch. Mark calls him a king. Matthew and Luke clean that up a bit, call him a tetrarch usually, but Mark calls him a king, and is a son of King Herod the Great. He's royalty. He's locally in Galilee is the closest thing they have to a king. So maybe some people thought of him that way. Jesus talks in Matthew 11, Luke 7 about, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? Somebody in royal robes, somebody in a palace. What did you got to see? Like a bruised reed? Oh boy. So he's talking about John the Baptist being the counter to that. John the Baptist criticized the marriage of Herod and Herodias And it obviously didn't go over well. Antipas couldn't afford too much criticism from somebody as popular as John was. And Josephus again talks about this. Where is this? I was going to say it's in Antiquities 20, paragraphs 200 and following, but that's James, the brother of Jesus, I think. Um, it's in book 18 of his Antiquities, before the passage about Jesus there. So Mark sometimes calls Antipas a king, but he was really only a tetrarch. Mark probably knows what happened to this would-be king. Herodias had a brother, Herod Agrippa the First. He's just called Herod, plain Herod, like some other Herods. In Acts chapter 12, he's really Herod Agrippa the First, and Acts just calls his son Agrippa the Second, uh, Agrippa, and actually is much more positive toward Agrippa the Second. He's pretty respectful towards Paul, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Agrippa the First was party buddies with Gaius Caligula in Rome. Caligula, actually, Agrippa got in trouble for saying he wished that Caligula was king, because it so happened that there was somebody else who was king at that point, the Emperor Tiberius. And so Agrippa got thrown into jail, but Tiberius finished dying. Gaius Caligula became emperor and took care of his old buddy, his party buddy. Agrippa became king over Judea and reigned from the years 41 to 44. And some things got to his head where he thought he was God. Josephus talks about it, as well as it happening in Acts chapter 12, and then he's struck dead, Acts 12:23. But anyway, Agrippa, reigned for a few years in Judea. But Antipas had only been tetrarch for an entire generation. And Herodias's full sister was really upset. And the people, they loved having a descendant of Herod and Mariamne, grandson of them, and actually the children of the two brothers. He and Herodias were children of the two brothers that Herod had executed under the false pretenses suggested by Antipater. But anyway, Herodias was jealous. My brother's a king. Why aren't you a king? Why have you just been a tetrarch for a whole generation? Come on, let's get ahead in life. But, and again, this is reported in Josephus, this is not in the New Testament, but no one could be a king unless the emperor says, I can be king. I'm not allowed to bring up the idea. The emperor has to suggest it. But Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that Herodias kept pestering him. So finally, Antipas petitioned the emperor and said, Mr. Emperor, sir, could I please become a king like my brother-in-law? And the emperor replied, hey, nobody gets to be king unless I say he can become king. This is treason. And so he banished Antipas to Gaul. And he said to Herodias, look, you don't have to go with him. You're the sister of my friend. And she started saying, no, you should make my brother a king. She was too used to being royalty. And so he said, look, you can go be banished with him. And I think Josephus has a couple different places that he mentions, but one of them is Gaul, which if you're going to be banished, southern France is not the worst place to be banished, probably. But Herod Antipas and Herodias spent their last days as exiles in Gaul. Not to rub it in, but they should have listened to John, shouldn't they? I mean, what was it that he said to the daughter of Herodias? I'll give you anything you ask for, up to half my kingdom. He wasn't a king. He couldn't give her half the kingdom. Even his governorship was at the disposal of Rome, but he's obviously drunk. Anyway, he says, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. He didn't lose just half his kingdom, or tetrarchy as it was. He lost the whole thing. Should have listened to John. Adultery never pays. Meanwhile, Herodias's brother, Agrippa the First, ended up accepting honor as if he were a god by some delegates from Tyre and Sidon. And, sometimes people kissed up to people in power. Flattery, it was called. Herodias, at least, was not guilty of that with the emperor. She was guilty of what philosophers considered not very guilty of bold speech, of confidence, in Greek, parousia, not parousia, but parousia. She spoke up. But anyway, Herod Agrippa had some flatterers, flattering him as if he were a god. And he was there in the theater in Caesarea, Josephus says. And God took care of him, took him out, took him a few days to finish dying. But yeah, Acts and Josephus agree on that point. So, yeah, just mentioned that. So let's summarize the Roman emperors of the first century and what happened when they ruled. Augustus was the first emperor. Julius Caesar was dictator. He wasn't imperator, which technically wasn't called a king. Augustus said he was the primus. He was the first among citizens. Very humble way to speak when you control everything. But Augustus was the first emperor, and we can talk more about him when we get to Luke chapter 2 later in the New Testament survey course. After him came Tiberius. Tiberius was paranoid and killed lots of people. He had some good reason to be paranoid. I mean, Augustus had Tiberius, adopted him as son, had him marry his daughter Julia. Julia was committing adultery on him. But anyway, the more thing for the paranoia, because Augustus ended up banishing his daughter, was that after he adopted Tiberius as his son and ordered him to marry Julia, he ordered Tiberius to marry Julia. He had to divorce his wife, whom he deeply loved. But, it's politics. And so he did it. And then he lost a couple sons to assassination, backhanded, secret ways of assassination. A lot of people were assassinated. So he was paranoid and he killed lots of people to protect himself. And the head of his personal police force, the imperial guard, Sejanus, fed on his fears, using them to eliminate all of his own political enemies. Now, Sejanus was not a member of the highest elite, but the emperor certainly was, and so Sejanus got his way a lot. He may have been the person who put Pontius Pilate in power. Now, I'm going to digress to talk about Pontius Pilate before finishing up on Sejanus. So what did Pontius Pilate do? His first act as governor was to bring idols into the holy city, nearly provoking a riot and a massacre. So, yeah, he did that under the cover of night. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls describe these as idols because they had the insignia of the emperor who was worshipped as a god, and there were these animal images and so on the Roman standards. These were objects of veneration and worship, and a delegation from Jerusalem came to Pilate in Caesarea and said, "Take these things from our holy city. You're desecrating our holy city." And Pilate said, "You Jews need to realize you're a conquered people, and you're going to have to do what we say." But sometimes bullies, you can get them to back down when you confront them with power. And their power was in their numbers. They all fell down before him, Josephus says, and said, "You can slit our throats, but you're going to have to kill every last one of us if you want to keep those idols in the holy city." And that was probably a bit too much bloodshed for the governor to get away with, without word getting back to Rome that he was incompetent. And he backed down. But he went downhill from there. He um, commandeered funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct, which was good Roman practice, but you don't do that with the Jerusalem temple. And there were other things that he did. So he was not one of Judea's favorite governors, although they didn't have a whole lot of really favorite governors. Do I digress at this point or later to talk about the governors before I go back to the kings? Let's let me at least finish up with Sejanus. Um, Sejanus actually got found out. He got reported to Tiberius, and Sejanus got executed. So that was in the year 31. If you date Jesus's crucifixion in the year 30, then that was before. Some people date Jesus' crucifixion after that. So Pontius Pilate, after after the year 31, he no longer had his powerful supporter in Rome on this theory. He stayed in power till 36, but eventually was recalled on the charge of corruption and excessive violence, massacring a bunch of Samaritans. But be that as it may, most of the Roman governors weren't very nice. There were no Roman governors when Herod Agrippa was king from 41 to 44. Again, he was very, very well loved by his people. Acts chapter 12 talks about that. Josephus talks about that. We have some later rabbinic traditions, memories about him that were positive about his fidelity, or his, not when he was party buddies with Caligula in Rome, not when he accepted veneration, but he knew how to play to a crowd. He did that in Rome, and he did that in Judea as well. Again, I'm not a fan, but I'm trying to integrate all the sources together. So there were no Roman governors during those few years when he was king, and that comeback of Judean monarchy helped propel Judean nationalism forward. So there was a conservative movement in the generation that followed until it culminated in destruction of the temple. But it didn't just culminate because of Judean nationalism. It was provoked by a bunch of incompetent, greedy governors. That's the way Josephus, of course, tells the story. Josephus had reasons to tell the story that way. But given the information that he gives us, even if they had a good side, they certainly had a bad side too. So there were several Roman governors after Agrippa died, most of them very corrupt. Felix was just as corrupt as Acts describes. In fact, Josephus says that he paid off one of the high priests to kill off one of the other high priests. I don't know how Josephus actually would know that, but a lot of corruption, both among the high priests, which we can talk about later in the course, of confiscating the tithes that were rightfully supposed to take care of the other priests, the poorer priests, so that some of them, Josephus has starved to death or had to leave the priesthood. But Felix was corrupt, took bribes and so on, eventually recalled on the charge of corruption. Luke is very nice in Acts 24:27, tells us that he goes back to Rome, but doesn't tell us why. But there was a period in between. That's when James was killed, according to Josephus. And the next Roman governor was Festus. Now, Josephus wasn't real nice about saying a bunch of nice things about these Roman governors, but Festus comes off as pretty judicious, smart guy, doesn't know a lot about how to run things exactly in Judea, but he runs things on good Roman order, and he gets Agrippa II. That's the son of Agrippa I, you might have guessed, who comes and visits him in Acts 25:13 and following with his sister Bernice, who was also, as you might have guessed, since she was sister of Agrippa II, She was the daughter of Agrippa the First. They had another sister named Drusilla, younger sister, who ended up married to Felix. They probably didn't appreciate that, given that she was Felix's third wife, but that's all another story. So all three of those figures show up in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 24, Drusilla is there along with her husband Felix. And then in Acts chapter 25, you have Drusilla's sister and brother, Bernice, and Agrippa II. So you don't have to memorize all these things unless you're in my class and taking it for credit. So at least memorize the chief members of the Herodian family so you can tell them apart and don't think, wait, didn't that guy die already? What's he doing over here? That's a different one. So Festus actually was fairly just by the usual standards of antiquity, but he apparently died in 2 years, after 2 years in office. Sorry, I said earlier, this is what happens when you only get 4 hours of sleep. That's when James was executed. James was executed when Festus apparently died before the new Roman governor could come. But we read about Felix and Festus in the book of Acts. Festus sends Paul off to Rome, but their successors, like Albinus and Florus, basically provoked the war with Rome. They were just so corrupt. And I mean, one of them went so far as to, according to Josephus, execute by crucifixion, which was normally used just for provincials and slaves and people who were condemned for certain crimes. He crucified Judean officials, members of the elite, who were also Roman citizens like Paul, which is a very rare privilege in the East. But these were such high officials; they were members of the equestrian class, the knight class, which is below the senatorial class. But so anyway, going back to Tiberius, he was emperor during Pilate's time. He's paranoid, trusted Sianus too much, but some of this stuff on these slides I need to correct. But anyway, he listened to a prestigious person who finally talked some sense into him. Sianus died, and if Pilate was his political appointee, he'd have to be more careful. But, they made him back down on other occasions. He really didn't want bad reports about him getting to Rome. And eventually that's what did him in. Bad report about him to Rome. Gaius Caligula was the successor to Tiberius. He's the one who was party buddies with Agrippa the First, and he was the emperor between Tiberius and Claudius. His father Germanicus, you don't have to remember all these names, but just have like kind of a sequence of the Roman emperors, if possible. Just, it'll give you some context when you're reading background stuff, and it's like, this was in the reign of Claudius, this was in the reign of so-and-so. Just, kind of the sequence in which they appeared. But Germanicus's dad, 4 hours of sleep, which is why I'm doing the video also, because we couldn't meet for class because classes were canceled because of the same weather event that caused me to only have 4 hours of sleep. So Caligula's dad, Germanicus, had been a popular Roman war hero, but he was killed through political intrigue. So Germanicus had a wife named Agrippina. This is Agrippina the First, to be distinguished from Claudius's second wife, Agrippina the Second. But you don't have to worry about memorizing the names of the Agrippinas. Agrippa, Agrippina, these were common Roman names, used also by, certain members of the Herodian family who kissed up to the Romans, as we mentioned before. So Germanicus, he had his wife with him. Usually officials didn't do that, but Germanicus, he's a prince. He carries his baby boy around the camp in little army boots. So Gaius, which was an extremely common Roman name, gets the nickname Caligula, Little Boots. That sounds innocuous enough, right? Maybe when he was a baby, he went nuts. He ordered his general, this is after he becomes emperor, to set up his image in Jerusalem's temple. That's where Agrippa got the idea of being liked as to be worshipped as a god. Now, in Rome, it was kind of a joke, the idea that you would become a god uh, for being emperor. But when an emperor died, then the next emperor could make the previous emperor god and could call themselves son of a god on their coins. But that wasn't going to go over too well in Jerusalem. I mean, if people would say, slit our throats rather than have these standards in our holy city, imagine how they would respond to having an image set up of a false god in Jerusalem's temple. Christians surely were praying, oh boy, looks like the Antichrist that was talked about by Jesus, well, didn't call him the Antichrist, that's First John and Second John, but using the language of Mark 13:14 and Matthew 24:15, which is borrowed from Daniel. But see, I need to get more sleep. So an abomination of desolation, or a desecrating sacrilege that would bring about destruction, bring about judgment on the temple because it was defiled. So Christians were praying like, it looks like it's already about to happen. So this is like less than 2 decades after Jesus's death and resurrection. So Judea nearly went to war with Rome in the 40s of the first century. But Caligula got assassinated, which was really helpful to his general Petronius because he'd ordered his Syrian legate to set up this image of him in Jerusalem. And Petronius sent a message back and said, that's really not a good idea if we don't want the entire Judean population to revolt. And the emperor sent back word to him saying, I ordered you to do it. You haven't done it yet? Kill yourself. I'm sending a new governor in your place. But fortunately, Caligula got assassinated. I'm not recommending assassinations by any means, but providentially, Caligula got assassinated, and word of that got to Petronius before Caligula's order to kill himself. So Petronius didn't have to kill himself, and Josephus says, God is nice to Gentiles who are nice to us. So after Gaius Caligula came Claudius, who probably wasn't executed partly because he was called a limper or a stutterer, whatever, but he was really smart guy, kind of a bookworm type. Yeah, as professors, aren't we all nice? No, not necessarily, but he did have an extreme weakness for getting himself into bad marriages. His first queen, Messalina, nearly did him in, but failed. She had another boyfriend, Silenus, and they were trying to take over the Roman Empire. Sometimes, again, these royal types, they are a little bit out of touch with reality about other people's power. Anyway, I won't say what happened to them, but so Claudius ends up in power. Tacitus, the Roman historian, portrays him as kind of a weak figure. He didn't order Messalina killed, but he also didn't ask his staff about it because apparently he didn't want to know. But anyway, his next queen, Agrippina, finished the job. Agrippina's physician reportedly finished Claudius off. No, some of the stuff in these slides, I did these from memory a long time ago, but my memory is a little better, even with 4 hours of sleep, than when I did some of these slides. Anyway, reportedly, first she gave him poisoned mushrooms. That's why I don't eat mushrooms. But then, normally, but Then, to finish him off, she had his physician stick a poison feather in his throat or something. So that's also why I try to avoid poison feathers. Now, the emperor after Claudius was named Nero. That was Agrippina's son. She brought into the marriage. Um, I'm not against mixed marriages. My family is mixed, but that's another story again. So after Agrippina died, his son Britannicus would have naturally been the heir to the throne, named after Claudius's glorious conquests in Britain. But Britannicus was a threat to Agrippina's ambition of putting her son on the throne. By the way, this is Agrippina the Younger. This is not the Agrippina who was married to Germanicus, who also got assassinated. It was dangerous to be a member of the elite. It was dangerous to be lots of people back then. I mean, the childhood mortality rate in most places was probably over 30%, many places over 40%. But again, that's another story. So that was true up until the like mid 1800s in even places like Germany. But after Claudius died, his son Britannicus was a threat to her ambition of putting her son on the throne. So she had Britannicus killed. Tasters would test his water to make sure it wasn't poisoned, which is a really dangerous position. But his water was warm. He said it's too warm. So they added some cold water to it. That was poisoned. Remember that the next time you get a drink somewhere. This is why I avoid ice in my drinks. Well, Nero married Octavia, who was Claudius's daughter. A lot of incest in these royal households. I mean, he was the adopted son, but legally that made him the full son. But anyway, they worked around it. But that would validate him more with the people, because anybody who liked Claudius then would say, okay, well, at least it's not Britannicus, but at least it's, the son-in-law of the Emperor Claudius. But he was also his adopted son. Actually, Augustus was not the biological son of Julius, nor was Tiberius the biological son of Augustus. In fact, through the Julio-Claudian dynasty, everybody from Julius Caesar to Claudius, none of them was the son of the preceding emperor biologically. They were all adoptive sons, and sometimes posthumously adopted. So keep that in mind when you say, if Jesus was descended from, you believe in the virgin birth, so Joseph is from the line of David, but what if Mary was not from the line of David? Then if he's the adopted son of the line of David, that's in this period full grounds for saying this is the son, Davidic heir. So anyway, Nero married Octavia, Claudius's daughter, but he didn't like her as much as he liked some other women and boys. So he had her imprisoned and killed. And I know my bias comes through here. I hate it when stuff like this happens, but yeah, my first time reading through Tacitus, the Roman historian, who has very dramatic narration of history, I was 12 years old, and I was just, it just got me. But later rereading it as a Christian from an adult perspective, I'm like, Paul, hurry up and get to Rome. People are dying. They need the gospel. But anyway, and there's a couple different versions. There's 3 different versions of the story with Poppaea Sabina, what ancient Roman historians said. According to one version, he forced her. According to another version, she was fine with it. She actually liked it, and her husband didn't mind too much either, being good friends with Nero and sleeping around. Nero said, you can go be governor in Spain. While he's governor in Spain, Otho was his name. Nero forced Poppaea Sabina to leave, or invited or welcomed Poppaea Sabina to leave her husband and sleep with him. And then when she was pregnant with his child, he kicked her to death. His main love, though, was his older boyfriend, Tigellinus, who taught him much of his other behavior. Now, I know some people don't think Nero was nearly as bad as Tacitus says, and maybe that's true. I mean, some of the stuff may just be dirt, maybe scandal. Suetonius, who wrote Lives of the Roman Emperors, writing in the early second century, he includes all the dirt on the emperors he doesn't like that he could find, apparently. So, but there was a reason why nobody after them liked them. So, to all the historians say really bad things about Nero. They say some good things about him too, but he was not anybody's. I shouldn't say he wasn't anybody's favorite. He was really popular in Greece. He was The Jewish people appreciated him because Poppaea Sabina was a benefactress to the Jewish people. She was Gentile, but she was nice to them. But then, after he kicked her to death, I'm not sure what they thought about that. Well, I'm sure what they thought about that, but I'm not sure how they necessarily viewed Nero. Some of them probably viewed him better than others. But anyway, Tigellinus had undue influence on him. So his mentors that were given him by, his stepdad, Claudius, Seneca, the philosopher, of whom you may have heard, or maybe not, and Burrus, who was the Praetorian prefect. Burrus disappeared. Seneca was part of a Roman assassination plot to get rid of Nero. The elite in Rome did not get along too well with Nero, so Seneca was ordered to kill himself. Being a good philosopher, he staged it to make people think he's like Socrates. But Seneca had some really good ideas, but we need to move on. Talking about the emperors, we can talk about philosophy another time. So Nero had been corrupted by his boyfriend Tigellinus and went crazy even before he grew up. Nero burned Christians alive to light his imperial gardens at night, and he claimed to be a god. This is in Tacitus's Annals 1544. Again, it looked like, to Jesus' followers, it looked like the final Antichrist had come. Nero also became famous for murdering his mother. Though again, from what we know about Agrippina, somebody needed to deal with her, as my papyrology professor at Duke put it. Now, again, I'm against assassination, but providentially, now I don't know. It was just that something happened to her, but not just that it was her son who did it. And again, maybe some of this is just dirt, but it was pretty widely known. I mean, there were people involved in making it happen, and there actually was in Greek, each letter also had a numeric value. They didn't have like 1, 2, 3 Hindu Arabic numerals. The first Greek letter, alpha, counted as 1, beta counted as 2, gamma counted as 3. Same with the Hebrew alphabet, aleph, bet, gimel, 1, 2, 3. So in Greek, there was circulating, apparently in bathroom graffiti in the Roman Empire, Nero Caesar is his name, killed his mother, it is the same. If you turn the letters in Nero Caesar into numerals and then add them up, it comes out to a certain number, over 1,000. Well, if you take this sentence, he killed his mother, and convert that into Greek, convert the Greek letters for that into Greek numerals, add them up, it comes out to the same. You say, what a remarkable coincidence. So Roman aristocrats revolted and Nero died. I mean, he was a lot of brutal things, but the most relevant to us is burning Christians alive to light his imperial gardens at night after the big fire in Rome, which happened in the year 64. And the executions may have been around 65 or so. He executed others of them in other ways. He needed a scapegoat in response to the fire. So yeah, he fed others to wild animals. Second Timothy and First Peter, on my view, address the persecutions of Nero's time. I know other people date Second Peter and Second Timothy and First Peter later than I do. Um, that can be talked about in my New Testament course when we get to the pastoral epistles and to First Peter. But to this day, the Armenian word for Antichrist is Nero, not Nero Caesar, but Nero. By the way, if you convert Nero Caesar into Hebrew letters, or, sorry, you use, yeah, you say it in Hebrew letters and convert that into numerals and you add them up. You wonder what that comes out to? Two ways to spell it in Hebrew. One comes out to 616. The other comes out to 666. So in Revelation 13, many scholars think that the cipher there, 666, is referring to Nero. There are some manuscripts of Revelation 13, 18 that have, it's 13, 16 through 18 is the Mark of the Beast passage. There are some manuscripts of Revelation that don't have 666, they have 616, as if somebody knew the answer to the riddle, but spelled it in Hebrew differently. We could maybe talk about that more whenever I talk about Revelation. But Nero was so evil, people thought he was going to come back. Imposters even arose claiming to be Nero. So we have that in different Roman historians who place it in different times, probably multiple imposters. But after Nero died, let me say one more thing about that. Imposters arose claiming to be Nero. One actually got the Parthians, the feared arch enemies of the Roman Empire, to cross the river Euphrates and invade the Roman Empire in Asia Minor until Rome confronted them and said, "We don't think this is really Nero. Cut off his head and hand it over, and we can have peace." And it worked. They cut off his head and handed it over. So, but Dio Chrysostom at the end of the first century said that most people thought that Nero was still alive. But he died with no will. Again, testament is what I mean there. Galba seized the throne. Galba got killed, also seized the throne. He was the former husband of Poppaea Sabina, who had been governor of Spain. Well, and when I say these other killed them, they didn't all directly kill them, but their armies took power. Vitellius, another general, seized the throne. And then Vespasian avenged the predecessors of Vitellius and seized the throne. And he had the biggest army. It was the army that had been waging war against Jerusalem. He didn't take the whole army there. He left Titus there to finish off the job. But Vespasian had been the general in charge of the army in Alexandria, well, in Egypt. That was the main source of Rome's grain supply. So they had a big army there to make sure nobody cut off the city's food supply. Before Nero died, Judea revolted in the year 66. Remember all those bad governors? They pushed things too far. So about 3.5 years later, Vespasian's son, Titus, whom he left, took Jerusalem. The temple was burned. Another desolation. Estimates are that over 1 million Jews died and others were enslaved. So this was like the most traumatic event in Jewish memory for the first century. Jewish people described Rome as a new Babylon. Now that was probably true even before Rome destroyed the temple. Certainly it would be true after Rome destroyed the temple. But in the Sibylline oracles, already Rome is compared to like a new Babylon. You have other things soon after that, fourth Ezra, second Baruch, different Jewish apocalypses, prophetic type works, which I haven't gone into to describe in this session. But those kind of works talked about, uh, yeah, they depicted Rome as like a new Babylon because it had destroyed the temple, but it was already considered like an evil empire. So Daniel chapter 7, you got four empires portrayed as four beasts, and Babylon was the first of those. Now, scholars of Daniel debate what the fourth one of those was, but in terms of what the fourth one was considered by Jewish people in the first century, it was Rome. So Rome was understood as being a new Babylon, and already 1 Peter 5:13, I think it's 5:13, sends a message from almost certainly Rome and says, I'm sending you this message from Babylon. Rome enslaved Jewish people, destroyed their temple. Rome was a mighty empire, just like Babylon was. This may have some implications for the book of Revelation. I'm not saying that the fall of Rome was the total fall of Babylon. You've got the four beasts blended together into like one composite land beast in Revelation 13, especially 1-7. But you've got a beast model after the beasts in Daniel chapter 7. Rome doesn't exhaust the picture of the beast in the book of Revelation. Again, the blending of the four beasts. But certainly Rome sat for the portrait, as some scholars put it, sat for the portrait. Rome was the Babylon of John's day. So here on the screen, you can see, if my cursor works, I'm not cursing, but my cursor works, you can see Rome, you can see Corinth, you can see, you can't see Judea on this map. Let's see. Yes, here you can see Judea, you can see Syria, and so forth. The emperor Vespasian had two sons, Titus and Domitian. Titus's girlfriend, according to Josephus, Titus's girlfriend when he was besieging Jerusalem was Bernice. You may remember her as Agrippa II's sister. She listened to Paul in Acts. She was part of the group along with her brother and with Festus, who said, Paul hasn't done anything under Roman law, but go ahead, send him to Rome, but we don't think he's guilty of something. Well, Titus had her as a girlfriend when he was in Judea, and according to Josephus, he told Bernice, if my father dies and I become emperor, you will be the empress. Well, when he became emperor, it was a long time later, and she came to Rome to be his wife, as he promised. But his advisors warned that the empire would never tolerate a Jewish empress, so he never let her come in. And Bernice eventually left without seeing him, brokenhearted. Josephus, like Tacitus, Roman historian, it really plays on your emotions with these dramatic scenes of different kinds. It keeps you reading if you ever want to read these things. The New Testament keeps you reading for different kind of reasons, but usually doesn't give you quite the same kind of extended sob stories. But I mean, they do make you sad. But anyway, here are busts of Titus and Domitian. You can tell they're busts because their noses are a little bit busted, right? But Domitian succeeded Titus. Titus was emperor only 2 years before he died. Vespasian actually comes off looking pretty good in the accounts of the he started a new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Vespasian comes off looking pretty good, but like some of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, it kind of goes downhill pretty fast. Some of the narrative of the Judges in the book of Judges does that too. But Domitian claimed to be a god while he was alive. Now, the only emperors who did that in Rome, they could be worshipped in Asia Minor, whatever, but the only ones in Rome who claimed to be emperor while they were, claimed to be a god while they were alive, were Caligula, Nero, and Domitian. And instead of getting deified after they died, people were like, not these guys. That was considered rude. You have to wait till you die to become deified in first century Roman ideology for the most part. But people were supposed to hail him, according to Suetonius, Lord and God. In John chapter 20, verse 28, and in Revelation, we read about the title Lord and God. It's actually borrowed from the Psalms in Greek, but you can imagine Domitian probably wouldn't have liked that. They were probably written in Domitian's reign. That's the majority view in any case. Domitian expelled astrologers. Why? He didn't want anybody predicting his downfall. According to many scholars, he persecuted Jews and Christians, or Jews or Christians. Asia Minor, though, would be extra enthusiastic in his worship. Emperor worship, the worship of kings was an ancient practice. Pharaoh thought he was a god. Babylonians, apparently, if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar's golden image may have been of himself. Daniel's three friends were supposed to bow down or else. Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, but when the oracle of Ammon in Egypt said Alexander was the son of Ammon, who was local equivalent of Zeus, it kind of went to his head. So Alexander was not supposed to do this. As far as Greeks were concerned, they were like, no, we don't worship kings. And also, we know who your dad was, Alexander, Philip of Macedon. But it kind of went to his head. And once he conquered most of the world that was known to most of the people in that sphere of influence, he had a great deal of influence. He did have to stop short of most of India. He was warring against Porus, but India was able to resist him. But he conquered basically all the Persian Empire. When the Romans conquered the Eastern Mediterranean, or some people came over voluntarily, they discovered that the people of Asia Minor, again, it's only 4 hours of sleep, but the video is free, don't complain. They discovered that the people of Asia Minor wanted to worship Rome's rulers. And the ideas were different in different places, exactly how to do it. But being real easy to get along with, the Romans said, hey, look, if these people, they worship our emperor and the goddess Roma, personification of us, that'll keep them loyal. So you can worship our emperors, just you emperors, don't let it go to your heads, because in Rome, we think this is really corny. You have to wait until you die, and then your successor makes you an emperor, makes you a god, and you can be the son of a god. No, you can become a god, and your successor can become the son of a god. I really need to go to bed, but I want to finish this before I do. Emperor worship was a big deal in Asia Minor. So Ephesus, which was in the Roman province of Asia, which was in Western Asia Minor, or Western Turkey today, we would say, Ephesus built the first temple for the worship of the emperor, for Augustus. Smyrna got permission to build the next one for the Emperor Tiberius. Pergamum had a big one. So you can tell this was probably an issue for the churches in Asia Minor, but it wasn't just the worship of the emperors. I mean, there were lots of fake deities worshipped there. Just a few years before Revelation was written, Ephesus got a second temple for the worship of the god or the emperor Domitian. So just don't claim to be emperor in Rome. Only the Christians and the Jewish people, those two categories overlapped, but only they were ready to say, the emperor has no clothes. In Rome, only 3 emperors claimed to be gods while they were alive. It didn't go well for them after they were dead. And I'm not speaking just theologically. The Jews were exempt from the worship of the emperor. So that would cover followers of the Jewish faith who were Christians, right? I mean, even if they were Gentiles, they worshiped the God of Israel. They claimed they worshiped the Jewish Messiah, although a lot of their Jewish compatriots disagreed with them on that. They followed Jewish sexual ethics, which were very rare in the Roman Empire. And they claimed exemption from idolatry, which was also quite rare in the Roman Empire. That privilege was given to the Jewish people to keep them from revolting, usually. This was a problem, though, because I mean it risks getting Judaism watered down as far as Jewish people were concerned. Hey, we got these Gentiles claiming an exemption. They're not even circumcised. They want to claim this exemption and say, we're Jewish, so we don't worship your emperor, and you need to excuse us from that. It could get the whole exemption rescinded. So there was conflict in some of the synagogues in Asia Minor, where some Jewish followers of Jesus, apparently, and maybe some Gentile followers of Jesus, were kicked out of the synagogues. And it was claimed, okay, you guys aren't Jewish. So this was especially in Smyrna and Philadelphia. This may be part of the background for the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. Some scholars also bring up a curse that was stated against schismatics, probably sometime in the late 1st century, and was applied to Jewish followers of Jesus. But we don't have like a standardization where everybody followed this already at the same time. But that probably reflects the kind of tensions that existed between the establishment at that point and followers of Jesus, who may have been big in number and certainly attracted a lot of Gentile converts, but they weren't in positions of power